Hello everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. The sun hung low over the Rocky Mountains on a June evening in 2007, casting long shadows across the western Colorado town of Grand Junction. It was a place where neighbors knew each other by name, where children rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on, and where the biggest concerns were whether the Rockies would make the playoffs, or if the summer heat would last through September. Grand Junction sat nestled in a valley, surrounded by red rock formations and desert landscapes that stretched endlessly in every direction. It was beautiful, peaceful, and safe. The kind of place where people moved to escape the chaos of bigger cities. The kind of place where terrible things weren't supposed to happen. On June 28, 2007, that illusion of safety began to crack. Paige Bergfeld was 34 years old, a mother of 3 young children, and by all accounts, the kind of woman who lit up every room she entered. She had long, dark hair that fell past her shoulders, warm brown eyes that sparkled when she smiled, and a personality that made everyone feel like they were her closest friend. She was the type of person who remembered birthdays, who brought homemade cookies to school events, who volunteered for every fundraiser and never missed a soccer game. Her children adored her. Her friends relied on her. Her family couldn't imagine life without her. Paige had been through difficult times in recent years. She'd gone through a divorce from her second husband, Rob Dixon, and was navigating the complicated world of single motherhood while trying to keep her various business ventures afloat. She sold kitchen products through a company called Pampered Chef, hosting parties in homes across the Grand Valley, where she'd demonstrate cookware and gadgets to groups of women who came as much for Paige's charm as for the products. She also ran a business called Models Inc., which she described as a modeling agency, though few people knew exactly what that entailed. Paige was always hustling, always working, always finding new ways to make ends meet and provide for her kids. She lived in a comfortable home in a quiet subdivision on the east side of Grand Junction. The house was neat and well kept, filled with family photos and her children's artwork. The neighborhood was the kind where people waved from their lawns and kept an eye out for each other's properties. Nothing bad happened here. Nothing violent. Nothing that would make the national news. But on that Thursday evening in late June, Paige Bergfeld vanished. It started with a phone call that never came. Paige had arrangements to pick up her children from her ex-husband's house that evening. She was meticulous about custody arrangements, never late, never forgetful. The children came first, always. When she didn't show up and didn't call to explain, Rob Dixon knew something was wrong. This wasn't like Paige. This wasn't normal. He tried calling her cell phone. It rang and rang, eventually going to voicemail. He tried again, same result. He called her house. No answer. He waited, thinking maybe she'd gotten caught up with a client or had car trouble. But as the minutes turned into hours and the sky darkened over the valley, a cold feeling of dread began to settle in his chest. By the next morning, when Paige still hadn't made contact, Rob called the police. The Grand Junction Police Department initially treated it as a standard missing person case. Adults go missing for all sorts of reasons: personal crises, impromptu trips, family emergencies. But when officers began looking into Paige's last known whereabouts, they discovered something that immediately elevated their concern. Paige's car had been found. A red 2005 Ford Focus registered to Paige Bergfeld had been discovered in the parking lot of a Lowe's home improvements side of town. The car was locked, sitting in the middle of the lot under the harsh Colorado sun. When officers gained access to the vehicle, what they found inside told a story of violence and chaos. The interior of the car had been burned. Someone had deliberately set a fire inside the vehicle, scorching the seats, melting the dashboard, filling the cabin with smoke and ash. But the fire had gone out before consuming the entire car, either because it ran out of fuel or because someone had extinguished it. The windows were intact, the doors still locked from the outside. Whoever had set the fire had done so and then left, sealing the evidence inside. Among the charred remains, investigators found Paige's purse, Her wallet was inside, credit card still intact. Her identification, her phone. Everything that a woman would normally take with her was still in the car. Everything except Paige herself. This was no longer a case of a woman who decided to take an unexpected trip. This was something far more sinister. News of the discovery spread quickly through Grand Junction. In a town of fewer than 50,000 people, word travels fast, especially when it involves someone as well known and well liked as Paige Bergfeld. The local newspaper, the Daily Sentinel, ran the story on the front page. Television news crews set up outside the Lowe's parking lot, filming B-roll of the coif scene while reporters speculated about what might have happened. Paige's family was devastated. Her father, Frank Bergfeld, was a prominent figure in the community, a successful businessman who'd built a comfortable life for his family. He'd watched his daughter grow into a devoted mother and entrepreneur, and now she was gone without explanation. Her mother, Suzanne, struggled to comprehend how this could happen. Paige's brother, also named Frank, immediately flew to Colorado to help with the search efforts. The family appeared on local news pleading for information. For anyone who might have seen Paige in the days before she disappeared. "If you have our daughter," Frank Bergfeld said to the cameras, his voice breaking, "please let her come home to her children. They need their mother." But as the days passed with no sign of Paige, hope began to fade. Investigators worked around the clock, interviewing everyone who knew Paige, retracing her final movements, trying to piece together what had happened. They spoke with her ex-husband, Rob Dixon, who cooperated fully and provided a clear timeline of his whereabouts. They talked to her friends, her pampered chef clients, her neighbors. They canvassed the area around the Lowe's parking lot, looking for witnesses who might have seen someone near the burned car. What they began to uncover was a portrait of a woman whose life was far more complicated than most people realized. On the surface, Paige was exactly who she appeared to be. A devoted mother working multiple jobs to support her children. But beneath that veneer of suburban normalcy, there were layers of secrecy that even her closest friends hadn't known about. As detectives dug deeper into Paige's business affairs, they discovered that Models Inc. was not what it seemed. The modeling agency was, in fact, an escort service. Paige had been running it for years, maintaining a carefully constructed double life that kept her two worlds completely separate. She had a website. She advertised her services online using various pseudonyms. She met clients at hotels, in their homes, sometimes in her own home when her children were with their father. She charged hundreds of dollars per appointment and had built up a steady clientele of men who were willing to pay for her company. Some encounters were purely social dinner dates, companionship, conversations with lonely men. Others were sexual in nature. Paige maintained strict boundaries, was selective about her clients, and ran her business with the same organizational skills she applied to everything else in her life. But escort work is inherently dangerous. It involves meeting strangers, often in private settings, usually late at night. It requires a level of trust that can be easily violated. Women who work in this industry are vulnerable to violence, exploitation, and predators who see them as easy targets. Paige knew the risks. She was careful. But no amount of caution can eliminate danger completely. As police interviewed Paige's escort clients, a process that required delicacy and discretion, a troubling picture began to emerge. Most of the men were ordinary, married, middle-aged, looking for companionship or physical intimacy they weren't finding at home. But there were others whose behavior raised red flags. Men who'd been too aggressive. Men who'd made Paige uncomfortable. Men who'd pushed boundaries or made veiled threats. One name kept coming up in the investigation: a client who'd had an intense, volatile relationship with Paige. Someone who'd been possessive, who'd wanted more than she was willing to give. Someone who hadn't taken rejection well. But identifying this person proved difficult. Paige had been meticulous about protecting her privacy and the privacy of her clients. She used disposable cell phones, changed her number frequently, and never kept detailed records that could be traced back to specific individuals. The few records she did keep were often in code or used only first names. She'd been running a business that required anonymity, and she'd been very good at maintaining it. Detectives also looked into Paige's financial situation. Despite working multiple jobs, she was struggling. She had debts. Her mortgage was behind. She was juggling credit card payments and trying to keep up appearances for her children and the community. The escort business had been lucrative, but it wasn't enough to solve her financial problems. Some investigators theorized that money trouble might have led her into a dangerous situation, perhaps a client who'd offered a large sum for a risky encounter, or someone who'd promised to help with her debts but had ulterior motives. The community rallied around Paige's family. Search parties combed the desert and canyon lands surrounding Grand Junction, looking for any sign of her. Volunteers distributed flyers with her photograph, plastering them on telephone poles and storefront windows throughout the valley. A reward fund was established, eventually growing to more than $50,000 for information leading to Paige's whereabouts. But as June turned into July and July into August, the searches produced nothing. No clothing, no personal effects, no trace of Paige Bergfeld anywhere in the vast expanse of western Colorado wilderness. The case began to grow cold. Investigators had interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on countless tips, and exhausted every lead they could find. The story slipped from the front pages of newspapers to the inside sections, and eventually disappeared from the news cycle altogether. Paige's family refused to give up hope, continuing to push for answers, but as the months stretched into years, it seemed increasingly likely that Paige's fate would remain a mystery. Her 3 children were left without their mother, growing up with questions that had no answers. Why had she disappeared? What had happened that night? Would they ever know the truth? The investigation remained open but inactive. Detectives kept the file on their desks, occasionally revisiting evidence or following up on new tips that came in, but there was nowhere left to look. Paige Bergfeld had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed, but the truth was out there waiting to be discovered. Because on that June evening in 2007, something terrible had happened to Paige. Someone had taken her. Someone had hurt her. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide what they'd done, burning her car to destroy evidence, concealing her body where it might never be found. And that person was walking free, living their life, thinking they'd gotten away with it, for now. Paige Bergfeld was born on October 8, 1972 in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado. She came into a world of comfort and stability. The daughter of Frank and Suzanne Bergfeld, who'd built a successful life through hard work and determination. Frank was an entrepreneur, a man who understood business and had instilled in his children the values of independence, resilience, and ambition. Suzanne was a devoted mother who created a warm, loving home for her family. They had everything they needed and most of what they wanted. From an early age, Paige showed signs of the charm and charisma that would define her adult life. She was outgoing, friendly, the kind of child who never met a stranger. She made friends easily, was popular in school, and seemed to glide through her childhood with the kind of ease that made everything look effortless. Teachers loved her. Other kids wanted to be around her. She was smart without being studious, pretty without being vain, confident without being arrogant. As she grew into her teenage years, Paige's beauty became more pronounced. She had classic features, high cheekbones, full lips, expressive eyes, and a smile that could melt the coldest heart. But it wasn't just her looks that drew people to her. It was her energy, her warmth, the way she made everyone feel special. She had a gift for making people feel seen and heard, a quality that would serve her well in both her legitimate businesses and her secret life. After graduating from high school, Paige attended college, though she didn't complete her degree. She was restless, eager to start her life, to make her mark on the world. She met her first husband in her early 20s, a man named Kevin, and they married in what seemed like a fairy tale romance. They had a child together, a son named Jess, and for a while life seemed perfect. They moved to Grand Junction, drawn by the slower pace of life and the opportunities in the growing community. But the marriage didn't last. The details of the divorce were private, handled quietly and amicably, at least outwardly. Paige retained primary custody of Jess and threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything else. She was determined to be the best mother possible, to give her son every advantage to create a stable, loving home despite the disruption of divorce. A few years later, she met Rob Dixon. He was kind, stable, employed. Everything that suggested he'd be a good partner and father figure for Jess. They fell in love quickly, married in 2000, and soon expanded their family. Paige gave birth to 2 more children, a daughter and another son. Now she had 3 kids to care for, 3 mouths to feed, 3 futures to secure. From the outside, Paige's life looked idyllic. She lived in a nice house in a good neighborhood. Her children were healthy and happy. She was involved in their schools, attended their sporting events, hosted birthday parties and playdates. She sold Pampered Chef products with enthusiasm, hosting parties where she'd demonstrate kitchen gadgets while women sipped wine and socialized. She was the picture of suburban motherhood, but behind closed doors the marriage to Rob Dixon was deteriorating. The exact reasons varied depending on who told the story, but the core issues were common ones: financial stress, personality differences, the strain of raising 3 children while trying to maintain a household. Paige wanted more than Rob could provide. She had expensive tastes, dreams of a lifestyle that required more money than a middle-class family in Grand Junction could easily afford. The divorce was finalized in 2006, less than a year before Paige's disappearance. It was contentious in ways that their first marriages hadn't been. There were disputes over custody, over money, over who got what in the division of assets. But eventually they reached an agreement. Rob would have the children on certain days, Paige would have them on others. They'd share holidays. They'd both contribute to raising the kids, even if they couldn't be together. For Paige, the divorce meant starting over financially. She had the house, but also the mortgage. She had custody of the children most of the time, which meant all the associated expenses. She had debts that had accumulated during the marriage: credit cards, car payments, the endless costs of maintaining a middle-class lifestyle. The Pampered Chef income wasn't enough. Even working every party she could book, demonstrating products night after night, the money wasn't sufficient. That's when Models Inc. became more than just a side project. Paige had started the escort service years earlier, possibly even before her divorce from Rob. The exact timeline was unclear, buried in the secrecy that surrounded that part of her life. But by 2007, it had become her primary source of income. The website she maintained advertised her as a companion for upscale gentlemen, available for dinner dates, social events, and private encounters. She used photos that showcased her beauty, while maintaining an air of sophistication. She wrote descriptions that emphasized her intelligence, her conversational skills, her ability to make a man feel special. She created multiple personas, using different names for different clients. Sometimes she was Carrie, sometimes Madison, sometimes other names that she'd change periodically to maintain anonymity. She had burner phones that she'd use for a few weeks or months before disposing of them and getting new ones. She kept her escort life completely separate from her mother life, scheduling appointments only when her children were with Rob, meeting clients in hotels or their homes, never mixing the two worlds. The money was good, much better than Pampered Chef. A single appointment could bring in several $100s, sometimes more than $1,000 depending on the client and what was requested. She could work a few nights a week and make enough to cover her bills, to buy her kids nice things, to maintain the appearance of stability and success that she so desperately wanted to project. But it was exhausting. Living a double life requires constant vigilance, constant lies, constant energy spent maintaining the facade. She had to remember which friends knew about which parts of her life, had to be careful about her social media presence, had to ensure that her children never suspected that their mother's modeling work was anything other than what she claimed it to be. Her friends knew her as devoted Mother Paige, the PTA volunteer, the soccer mom, the woman who brought the best snacks to school events. Her family knew her as their beloved daughter and sister, working hard to make ends meet after a difficult divorce. Her Pampered Chef clients knew her as the enthusiastic saleswoman who could make cooking fun. Her escort clients knew her as the beautiful, attentive companion who made them feel desired and important. Only Paige knew all the versions of herself, and the strain of maintaining them all was beginning to show. In the months before her disappearance, friends noticed that Paige seemed stressed. She was more tired than usual, more distracted. She'd show up to pampered chef parties looking exhausted. Though she'd rally and put on her usual charming performance, she'd canceled plans more frequently, citing work commitments or family obligations. She'd been quieter, less effusive, as if the weight of everything she was carrying was finally becoming too heavy. Her financial situation was worsening. Despite the escort income, she was falling behind on bills. The mortgage was in arrears. Credit card companies were calling. She'd borrowed money from family members, always with promises to pay it back soon. Always with explanations about how a big sale was coming through, or how she was about to land a major client. But the money never seemed to be enough. Some of her friends later recalled conversations where Paige had seemed frightened. She'd mentioned having trouble with a client, someone who wasn't respecting boundaries, someone who made her uncomfortable. But she'd been vague about the details, never naming names, never explaining exactly what the problem was. In hindsight, these conversations took on a more ominous tone, but at the time, they seemed like the kind of work complaints anyone might have. Paige also talked about wanting to get out of the escort business. She was tired of the risk, tired of the secrecy, tired of the toll it was taking on her psychologically. She wanted to find a legitimate career that could support her lifestyle. Something that didn't require her to sell her body or her time to strangers. But she didn't know what that would be, and she couldn't afford to stop until she found an alternative. In the days immediately before her disappearance, Paige had several appointments scheduled. Investigators would later reconstruct her calendar, based on phone records and witness statements. She'd met with pampered chef clients during the day, hosting a party on June 27th that went late into the evening. She'd been her usual charming self, laughing and joking with the women in attendance, demonstrating products with enthusiasm and skill. After the party ended and she cleaned up, she'd returned home. Her children were with Rob that night, so she had the house to herself. Phone records showed that she'd made several calls that evening, some to known escort clients, some to numbers that investigators couldn't trace. She'd sent text messages, brief and cryptic, arranging appointments or confirming details. The last confirmed sighting of Paige Burrell alive was around 7:00 on June 20, 2007. A neighbor saw her pulling out of her driveway in her red Ford Focus, heading toward the main road that led out of the subdivision. She appeared to be alone. She wasn't in any obvious distress. She was simply leaving, the way she had countless times before. Where was she going? Who was she meeting? These questions would haunt investigators for years. Phone records showed that her cell phone remained active for several more hours that evening. She'd made calls, received calls, sent text messages. The last activity on her phone was around 10:30 p.m., when the device either died, was turned off, or was destroyed. After that silence, sometime between 10:30 p.m. on June 28th and the early morning hours of June 29th, Paige Birdfeld ceased to exist as far as the digital world was concerned. Her phone went dark. Her social media accounts went dormant. Her bank accounts showed no new activity. It was as if she'd simply evaporated into the warm Colorado night. By the time Rob Dixon called the police the next day, precious hours had already been lost. The first 24 to 48 hours after a disappearance are critical for finding someone alive, and much of that window had already closed before authorities even knew Paige was missing. The discovery of her burned car intensified the urgency. This wasn't a woman who'd left voluntarily. This was a crime scene. Someone had taken Paige, had done something to her, and had then attempted to destroy evidence by setting fire to her vehicle. The partially burned interior suggested either incompetence or interruption. Perhaps the arsonist had been surprised by someone approaching, or perhaps they'd simply been unsuccessful in their attempt to completely destroy the car. Forensic investigators went over the Ford Focus with meticulous care. They collected ash samples, looking for accelerants that might identify what had been used to start the fire. They dusted for fingerprints, though the heat and smoke had degraded most surfaces. They pulled data from the car's computer system, looking for information about where the vehicle had been driven in the days before the fire. What they found raised more questions than it answered. The car had been driven to several locations in Grand Junction in the days before Paige's disappearance: her home, several hotels, a few residential addresses, and finally the Lowe's parking lot. Some of these locations corresponded with known escort appointments. Others remained mysteries. Inside the burned vehicle, investigators found personal items that survived the fire. A makeup compact, melted but recognizable, jewelry that Paige had been wearing, receipts from gas stations and convenience stores, and buried under the scorched front seat, a day planner with partially burned pages that contained names, phone numbers, and appointment times written in Paige's handwriting. This planner would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case, though deciphering the coded entries and burned pages would take months of painstaking work. Paige had been careful to use only first names or initials, to write times without specific details about what the appointments entailed. But cross-reference with phone records and witness statements, the planner began to reveal the secret architecture of Paige's double life. As July 2007 turned into August, the investigation expanded beyond Grand Junction. Police contacted escort services in other cities, looking for connections or patterns. They reached out to law enforcement agencies across Colorado and neighboring states, checking for similar cases or unsolved crimes that might be related. They brought in FBI profilers to develop a psychological portrait of the likely suspect. The profile that emerged was troubling. The perpetrator was likely someone who knew Paige personally, possibly a client but potentially someone from her legitimate life. The burning of the car suggested an attempt to destroy evidence, which indicated planning and premeditation rather than a crime of passion. The fact that the fire hadn't completely consumed the vehicle suggested either panic or amateurism. An experienced criminal would have likely been more thorough. The choice to leave the car in a public parking lot was also significant. It was both brazen and strategic. Public spaces have surveillance cameras, which meant risk of detection, but they also have plausible deniability. Anyone could have abandoned a car in a busy parking lot. The Lowe's location was near a major highway, suggesting that the perpetrator might have had another vehicle waiting, or might have had someone pick them up after abandoning Paige's car. Investigators theorized several scenarios. Perhaps Paige had met a client for an appointment and something had gone wrong. Perhaps she'd been abducted from her home or intercepted while driving. Perhaps someone had lured her to a specific location with false pretenses. Each theory had evidence to support it and gaps that couldn't be filled. The most promising leads came from Paige's phone records. In the weeks before her disappearance, she'd been in frequent contact with several numbers. Detectives tracked down the owners of these numbers, interviewing each one, looking for suspicious behavior or inconsistencies in their stories. Most of the men were exactly what appeared to be ordinary people who'd hired Paige for companionship, who'd had unremarkable encounters with her, and who were shocked to learn of her disappearance. They cooperated with police, provided DNA samples when requested, and were eventually ruled out as suspects. But there were a few who raised concerns. Men who seemed too nervous during interviews. Men whose alibis had holes or inconsistencies. Men who'd had conflicts with Paige or who'd expressed anger when she'd ended their arrangement. One client in particular caught investigators' attention. He'd been seeing Paige regularly for months, had developed what seemed to be emotional attachment beyond a typical client relationship, and had become upset when Paige tried to establish firmer boundaries. Phone records showed he'd called her repeatedly in the days before her disappearance, sometimes late at night, sometimes in rapid succession that suggested desperation or anger. When detectives interviewed him, his story changed multiple times. First, he claimed he hadn't seen Paige in weeks. Then he admitted he'd met her a few days before she disappeared, but said it had been a cordial encounter. Finally, under pressure, he acknowledged that they'd had an argument about money and the terms of their arrangement. His alibi for the night of June 28th was weak. He claimed he'd been home alone, watching television, but couldn't provide specifics about what he'd watched or any witnesses who could corroborate his whereabouts. His demeanor during questioning was defensive and evasive. He refused to take a polygraph test. He asked for a lawyer. Police began building a case around this suspect, but they lacked the crucial element they needed: physical evidence connecting him to Paige's disappearance. There was no forensic evidence in her car that pointed to him specifically. No witnesses had seen them together on June 28th. Without a body, without a crime scene beyond the burned car, prosecutors were reluctant to move forward. The case stalled again. Paige's family refused to accept that they might never know what happened. Frank Bergfeld became a fixture at the Grand Junction Police Department, stopping by regularly to check on the investigation's progress, to offer new theories, to beg detectives not to let his daughter's case go cold. He hired private investigators to run parallel investigations, hoping they might find something law enforcement had missed. Suzanne Bergfeld established a foundation in Paige's name, dedicated to helping other families of missing persons. She appeared on national television programs, telling Paige's story, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The family never gave up hope that Paige might still be alive, even as the rational part of their minds understood that with each passing day, the likelihood of finding her alive diminished. Paige's children grew older without their mother. Jess, the eldest, took on more responsibility in the household, helping to care for his younger siblings. The two younger children struggled to understand why their mother had left and where she'd gone. Rob Dixon did his best to provide stability, but nothing could fill the void that Paige's absence created. In Grand Junction, life moved on. New stories dominated the headlines. New crises captured public attention. Paige's disappearance became local lore. The kind of unsolved mystery that people would reference occasionally, but that no longer generated the same urgency it had in those first terrible weeks. But somewhere someone knew the truth. Someone knew where Paige was. Someone knew what had happened on that June evening. Someone carried the weight of that knowledge, living with the secret of what they'd done. And eventually, secrets have a way of coming to light. The investigation into Paige Bergfeld's disappearance consumed the Grand Junction Police through the summer and fall of 2007. Detective Sergeant Wayne Whaler became the lead investigator on the case, a veteran cop with decades of experience who'd never encountered anything quite like this. Whaler was methodical, patient, the kind of investigator who believed that every case could be solved if you asked enough questions and followed enough leads. He'd solved murders before, had put killers behind bars. But those cases had bodies, crime scenes, physical evidence. This case had none of those things. What it did have was a digital footprint. Paige's phone records, her computer, her day planner. These became the roadmap that investigators followed as they tried to reconstruct her final days. Whaler assembled a team of detectives and began the painstaking process of identifying every person Paige had been in contact with in the weeks before she vanished. The list was long. Paige had been a social person, constantly on her phone, constantly making connections. There were pampered chef clients, friends from her children's schools, family members, and then the escort clients. Dozens of men who'd hired her for companionship over the months and years she'd been running Models Inc. Each name had to be run down, each person interviewed, each alibi verified. It was slow, tedious work, made more complicated by the sensitivity required when dealing with the escort clients. Many of these men were married professionals, people with reputations to protect. They were terrified that their involvement with Paige would become public, that their families would find out, that their careers would be destroyed. Some lawyered up immediately, refusing to cooperate until granted immunity from prosecution for solicitation. Others spoke freely, eager to help find Paige and prove they had nothing to do with her disappearance. Whaler approached each interview with the same careful attention. He wasn't interested in destroying lives or exposing affairs. He was interested in finding Paige. He made deals, offered assurances of discretion, promised that their involvement would remain confidential as much as possible. Slowly, the men began to talk. What emerged was a portrait of Paige as a consummate professional in her escort work. She was punctual, reliable, and maintained clear boundaries with clients. She didn't use drugs, didn't drink excessively during appointments, and was selective about who she'd see. If someone made her uncomfortable or violated her rules, she'd end the arrangement and block their number. She ran her business like any other service industry. Customer satisfaction mattered. but so did her safety and dignity. Most of her clients were regulars, men she'd been seeing for months or even years. These appointments were often routine, almost mundane. Dinner at a restaurant, conversation at a hotel bar, a few hours of companionship and then home. The physical encounters, when they occurred, were transactional but not cold. Paige had a gift for making men feel special, for creating the illusion of genuine connection even in a paid arrangement. But there were clients who wanted more than Paige was willing to give. Men who fell in love with her, or convinced themselves they had. Men who couldn't accept that her affection was professional rather than personal. Men who became possessive, jealous, demanding. As detectives worked through the list of clients, several names rose to the top of their suspect list. These were men who'd had problematic interactions with Paige, who'd pushed boundaries, who'd reacted badly when she'd tried to end their arrangement. One was a businessman from out of town who'd flown to Grand Junction regularly to see Paige. He'd showered her with expensive gifts, had talked about leaving his wife, had proposed increasingly elaborate scenarios where they could be together permanently. Paige had been clear that their relationship was business only, but he'd persisted. When she'd finally cut off contact, he'd sent dozens of angry texts and emails, calling her a liar and a tease, threatening to expose her business to her family and friends. Detectives interviewed him at his home in another state. He was defensive, angry at being questioned, insistent that he had nothing to do with Paige's disappearance. His alibi was solid. He'd been at work in another state on June 28th, with multiple witnesses and electronic records to prove it. Security footage showed him entering his office building that morning and not leaving until evening, long after Paige had last been seen. He was crossed off the list. Another client had a history of domestic violence. He'd been arrested twice for assaulting previous girlfriends, though the charges had been dropped both times when the women declined to testify. He'd seen Paige several times over a few months, and she'd mentioned to a friend that he made her nervous, that he'd been toothed during one encounter. When she'd refused to see him again, he'd shown up at her house unannounced, demanding to speak with her. She'd threatened to call the police, and he'd left, but not before making vague threats about teaching her a lesson. This suspect looked promising. He had a history of violence against women, a known conflict with Paige, and a personality type that fit the profile of someone who might harm her. Detectives brought him in for questioning, pressing him about his whereabouts on June 28th. He claimed he'd been at a bar with friends, drinking and watching a baseball game. The friends corroborated his story, though their accounts were hazy about specific times. He'd left the bar around 10 p.m., he said, and gone home alone. No one could verify what he'd done after that. His phone records showed he'd made several calls that night, including one to a number that investigators couldn't identify. Whaler's team obtained a search warrant for his house and vehicle. Forensic technicians went through both with fine-toothed combs, looking for any trace of Paige DNA, hair, blood, clothing fibers. They found nothing. His car showed no signs of having been cleaned recently or having transported a body. His home contained no evidence of violence or struggle. Without physical evidence, prosecutors wouldn't touch the case. The suspect knew it too. He became increasingly cocky during subsequent interviews, almost daring detectives to charge him. Eventually, they had to let him go. More names, more interviews, more dead ends. There was the client who'd been obsessed with Paige's feet, who'd paid extra just to photograph them, who'd created entire albums of pictures he'd taken during their sessions. Weird, yes, but not criminal. His alibi was airtight. There was the married man who'd been seeing Paige for years, who'd told his wife he was at business conferences when he was actually with Paige. When his wife finally discovered the credit card statements, there'd been a vicious confrontation. He'd blamed Paige for destroying his marriage, had called her terrible names, had told her he hoped she'd end up dead in a ditch somewhere. Detectives looked hard at him, but his wife, despite her anger and heartbreak, confirmed he'd been home with her the night Paige disappeared. She had no reason to protect him. In fact, she seemed to relish the idea of him being a suspect. But she couldn't lie about what she knew to be true. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation began to focus on one particular Lester Roth Jones. Jones was 50 years old in 2007, a long-haul truck driver who lived in the small town of Fruita, just outside Grand Junction. He was heavy-set, balding, unremarkable in almost every way. He drove routes across Colorado and neighboring states, delivering goods for various companies. He'd been married once years ago, but was divorced and lived alone in a modest mobile home on a rural property outside town. Jones had been a client of Paige's for several months before her disappearance. Phone records showed frequent contact between them, with calls and texts exchanged regularly. He'd seen her at least a dozen times, paying her for appointments that ranged from a few hours to overnight stays. But something about the arrangement had soared in the weeks before Paige vanished. The frequency of their contact increased dramatically in late May and early June, with Jones calling and texting Paige multiple times per day. Some of the texts were affectionate, others were demanding. Paige's responses became shorter and less frequent, a pattern that suggested she was trying to create distance. On June 22, 2007, 6 days before Paige disappeared, Jones had sent her a series of increasingly agitated text messages. He wanted to see her. She said she was busy. He offered to pay double her normal rate. She declined. He asked what he'd done wrong. She didn't respond. He called 12 times in 3 hours. She didn't answer. The next day, Paige had called a friend and mentioned that a client was freaking out on her, that she was considering blocking his number because he was becoming too intense. She didn't name Jones specifically, but the timing matched. On June 27th, the day before Paige disappeared, Jones called her 4 times. The first 3 calls went unanswered. The 4th call connected and lasted 6 minutes. What was said during that conversation would become one of the central mysteries of the investigation. On June 28th, Jones called Paige 3 times, once at 24:07 p.m., once at 6:18 p.m., and once at 9:43 p.m. The first 2 calls went to voicemail. The 3rd call connected and lasted less than a minute. After 9:43 p.m., there were no more calls between Jones and Paige. In fact, there were no more calls from Paige's phone to anyone. The device went silent at approximately 1:30 p.m. that night and never showed activity again. When detectives first interviewed Jones in early July, he was cooperative but nervous. He admitted knowing Paige, admitted hiring her for escort services, admitted that he'd been calling her frequently. But he denied having anything to do with her disappearance. He said the last time he'd seen Paige was several days before she vanished. They'd met at a hotel in Grand Junction for a few hours. It had been a normal appointment, he claimed. Nothing unusual had happened. She'd been friendly and professional, just like always. When asked about the phone calls on June 28, Jones said he'd been trying to arrange another appointment, but Paige had told him she was too busy. The brief call at 9:43 p.m. had been him checking in one last time, he said. But she told him she couldn't see him and had ended the call. His story seemed plausible, but something about Jones's demeanor bothered Whaler. The truck driver was too calm, too rehearsed in his answers. When asked about his whereabouts on the evening of June 28th, Jones said he'd been at home alone, watching television and doing paperwork for his trucking job. No witnesses could confirm this. No electronic records supported it. Detectives asked if they could search Jones's truck and home. He refused, saying he wanted to speak with a lawyer first. That refusal raised red flags. Innocent people often consent to searches because they have nothing to hide. Guilty people lawyer up. Whaler obtained search warrants for both Jones's truck and his mobile home. The searches were conducted in mid-July, nearly 3 weeks after Paige's disappearance. Forensic teams spent hours going through both locations, looking for any evidence that Paige had been there, any signs of violence, any indication that Jones was involved in her disappearance. They found nothing conclusive. There were no traces of Paige's DNA in the truck or the home. No blood, no hair, no personal items that could be definitively linked to her. The truck had been cleaned recently. Jones said that was routine, that he cleaned it regularly as part of his job. The home was messy but not suspicious, filled with the detritus of a single man living alone. But investigators did find some interesting items. In Jones's home, they discovered a collection of photographs, not of Paige specifically, but of other women. Some appeared to be professional glamour shots or modeling photos, the kind you might find in magazines. Others looked like candid photographs, pictures taken without the subject's knowledge. Women at gas stations, women in parking lots, women walking down the street. Jones explained these away as a hobby. He liked photography, he said. He liked taking pictures of pretty women. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't evidence of anything. In his truck, investigators found a length of rope, the kind that could be used to bind someone. Jones said it was work equipment, that he used it to secure loads in his truck. Again, not illegal, not proof of anything. They found a set of zip ties, also explained away as work-related. They found a roll of duct tape, a tarp, all items that could have innocent explanations or sinister ones, depending on context. What they didn't find was Paige, without a body, without physical evidence linking Jones to Paige's disappearance. Prosecutors couldn't build a case strong enough to charge him. Jones was released, though he remained under surveillance. Detectives followed him, watched his property, monitored his phone. They were convinced he was involved but couldn't prove it. Jones seemed to know he was being watched. He moved carefully, deliberately, never doing anything that might give investigators cause to arrest him. He continued working his trucking routes, living his quiet life in Fruita, acting for all the world like a man with nothing to hide. But Whaler didn't give up. He kept digging into Jones's background, looking for anything that might connect him to other crimes or violent behavior. What he found was disturbing but not definitive. Jones had a history of soliciting prostitutes going back decades. He'd been arrested twice in the 1990s for solicitation in other states but had only received fines. He'd been investigated in connection with the assault of a sex worker in Nevada in 2003, but the case had been dropped when the victim recanted her statement. There were reports from other escorts who'd worked with Jones over the years. Some said he'd been a normal client, quiet and respectful. Others described him as pushy, demanding, someone who got angry when things didn't go his way. One woman said he'd refused to pay after an appointment and had physically prevented her from leaving until she agreed to waive the fee. She'd eventually escaped and called the police, but by the time officers arrived, Jones was gone, and she'd been too frightened to press charges. None of this proved he'd killed Paige, but it painted a picture of a man with a problematic relationship with sex workers, someone who felt entitled to control them, someone who reacted badly to rejection. Whaler built a timeline of Jones's movements in the days around Paige's disappearance. Using cell phone tower data, GPS records from his trucking company, and witness statements, investigators were able to place Jones in Grand Junction on June 28. His truck had been seen in the area where Paige's car was later found abandoned. The timing was suspicious but not conclusive. Jones's cell phone had pinged off towers near the Lowe's parking lot on the night of June 28 and early morning of June 29. But Jones explained this by saying he'd driven past that area on his way home to Fruita. The towers had a range of several miles. Being in the general area wasn't proof of anything. The investigation hit another wall. By late 2007, the case was still officially active, but the leads had dried up. Detectives had interviewed hundreds of people, served dozens of search warrants, followed up on countless tips from the public. They'd pursued every promising lead and most of the unpromising ones. They'd spent thousands of hours and exhausted their budget for the investigation. And they had nothing. No body, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, no confession, no physical evidence that could definitively link any suspect to Paige's disappearance. The district attorney's office reviewed the case and concluded that while Lester Jones remained the most likely suspect, there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. They needed more. They needed the crucial piece that would transform suspicion into proof. The case went cold, but Paige's family refused to let her be forgotten. Frank Bergfeld, her father, became a passionate advocate for missing persons, using his daughter's case to push for changes in how law enforcement handled such investigations. He lobbied for better resources, better coordination between agencies, better training for officers who handled these cases. He also kept pressure on the Grand Junction Police Department, calling regularly, meeting with prosecutors, ensuring that Paige's case stayed on their radar even as years passed without progress. In 2008, On the first anniversary of Paige's disappearance, the family held a memorial service. Hundreds of people attended, friends, neighbors, clients from her pampered chef business, people who'd never even met Paige but who'd been moved by her story. They lit candles, shared memories, and prayed for answers. Paige's children, now a year older, stood with their father and grandparents, trying to comprehend why their mother was still gone. The eldest, Jess, spoke briefly, his voice breaking as he talked about missing his mom, about wanting her to come home, about the hole in his life that nothing could fill. In 2009, 2 years after the disappearance, investigators received a tip that seemed promising. A woman called the police department saying she'd been hiking in the desert east of Grand Junction and had found what she thought might be human bones. Detectives rushed to the location, bringing cadaver dogs and forensic anthropologists. The bones turned out to belong to a deer. Another dead end. Over the next few years, there would be other false alarms. Hikers would find remains that turned out to be animal bones. Psychics would call in with visions of where Paige's body could be found. Anonymous tipsters would claim to know what happened, then disappear when investigators tried to follow up. Each time, the family's hopes would rise, then crash back down when the lead went nowhere. Lester Jones continued living in Fruita, working his trucking routes, maintaining his innocence. Occasionally, reporters would track him down and ask about Paige. He'd say he had nothing to do with her disappearance, that he wished the police would leave him alone, that he was tired of being accused of something he didn't do. He never showed much emotion when discussing Paige. Never seemed particularly concerned about what might have happened to her. Just annoyance that he was being bothered about it. Detectives continued to monitor him, but without new evidence, there was nothing more they could do. The surveillance eventually ended due to budget constraints. Jones was left alone. The years dragged on. 2011-2012. Paige's children grew into teenagers without their mother. Her family aged, the grief settling into a permanent ache that never quite went away. Grand Junction moved on, though people still talked about the case occasionally, still wondered what had happened to the beautiful woman who'd vanished without a trace. And then, in March 2012, nearly 5 years after Paige disappeared, a rancher made a discovery that would change everything. The rancher was checking his property in Wells Gulch, a remote area about 20 miles south of Grand Junction. It was rugged country, dotted with sagebrush and juniper trees, cut through with dry washes and rocky outcroppings. The land was vast and empty, the kind of place where you could hide something and reasonably expect it would never be found. He was walking through a particularly isolated section of his property when he noticed something unusual. There were bones scattered in a shallow area, partially covered by dirt and debris. At first, he thought they were animal remains. Ranchers in this area came across dead cattle and wildlife all the time. But something made him look closer. The bones were small, delicate. The skull, when he found it partially buried nearby, was unmistakably human. He called 911 within hours. The site was swarming with investigators. Crime scene tape was strung up. Forensic anthropologists were brought in. Detectives who worked Paige's case scrambled to get to the location. The remains were skeletal, scattered over an area of about 50 feet. Animals had disturbed the site, dragging bones away from the original location. Weather and time had bleached them white. But enough remained to tell a story. The forensic team worked carefully, photographing every bone in place before collecting them. They sifted through dirt looking for personal effects, for clothing fragments, for anything that might identify the victim or explain how they'd died. They found shreds of fabric, deteriorated by exposure to the elements but still identifiable as women's clothing. They found jewelry, a necklace, earrings, a bracelet. They found long strands of dark hair still attached to the skull. Most importantly, they found dental work. The skull contained several dental fillings and crowns, work that could be matched against dental records. It took less than a week to make the identification. The remains belonged to Paige Birdfeld. After nearly 5 years of searching, of hoping, of wondering, the family finally had their answer. Paige was dead. She wasn't coming home. The worst fears that they'd tried so hard not to acknowledge were confirmed. The medical examiner studied the bones carefully, looking for any indication of how Paige had died. There was no obvious trauma to the skull, no bullet holes, no evidence of blunt force injury. The bones showed no signs of being cut or broken in ways consistent with stabbing or beating. But the hyoid bone in the neck was fractured. This small, delicate bone is often broken in cases of strangulation. It was the only physical evidence of how Paige might have died, and even that wasn't definitive. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, but couldn't specify the exact cause with certainty. Strangulation was most likely, but other methods couldn't be ruled out. What was clear was that Paige had been murdered and her body dumped in this remote location where it might never have been found. The killer had chosen the site carefully, isolated, rarely visited, far from any roads or hiking trails. If not for the rancher's chance decision to check that particular corner of his property, Paige might have remained there indefinitely. The discovery of the body changed the investigation entirely. Now prosecutors had evidence of a murder. Now they could build a case. Now they could seek justice. Detective Wayne Whaler, who'd never given up on finding Paige, was brought back onto the case full-time. The original investigation files were pulled out, reviewed, analyzed with fresh eyes and new urgency. All roads led back to Lester Jones. Investigators returned to Jones's property with new search warrants. This time they were looking for specific evidence. Anything that could place Paige at Jones's home. Anything that could connect him to the Wells Gulch location where her body had been found. They brought ground-penetrating radar to scan his property for other burial sites. They brought cadaver dogs to search for any trace of decomposition. They tore apart his mobile home, his vehicles, his outbuildings. In a storage shed on Jones's property, investigators found something significant, a GPS unit that Jones had used in one of his trucks. The device had been replaced years ago and thrown in the shed, forgotten. But the GPS had a memory, storing data about where the vehicle had been driven. Forensic analysts extracted the data. Among the thousands of logged waypoints and routes, they found something remarkable. In late June 2007. Jones's truck had been driven to an area very close to Wells Gulch, the location where Paige's body was eventually found. The GPS coordinates weren't exact. The device had a margin of error of several hundred feet, but they placed Jones's truck within a quarter-mile of the body dump site, right around the time Paige disappeared. Jones had never mentioned driving to that area. He'd told investigators he'd been on his regular trucking routes during that time, routes that didn't go anywhere near Wells Gulch. This was the contradiction investigators had been looking for. Further analysis of Jones's cell phone records from 2007 showed his phone pinging off towers in the Wells Gulch area during the early morning hours of June 29, 2007, less than 12 hours after Paige's last known phone activity. The pieces were starting to fit together. The evidence was circumstantial but building into something substantial. Prosecutors convened a grand jury to review the evidence against Lester Jones. Over several weeks, witnesses testified, evidence was presented, and the case was laid out in detail. On November 7, 2014, more than 7 years after Paige's disappearance, the grand jury returned an indictment. Lester Ralph Jones was charged degree murder, second-degree murder, and second-degree kidnapping in the death of Paige Bergfeld. Police arrived at Jones's home early in the morning to execute the arrest warrant. He answered the door in his pajamas, looking confused and frightened. When officers told him he was under arrest for Paige's murder, he shook his head slowly. "I didn't do this," he said. "I didn't kill her," but the evidence said otherwise. Jones was taken into custody without incident. He didn't resist, didn't fight. Just stood there in his doorway looking stunned as officers read him his rights and placed handcuffs around his wrists. Neighbors watched from their windows as he was led to a police cruiser and driven away. The quiet morning fruited by flashing lights and the murmur of gathering onlookers. The arrest made headlines across Colorado and beyond. After more than 7 years, the Paige Bergfeld case was finally moving toward resolution. News stations replayed old footage of Paige, smiling at pampered chef parties, posing with her children, the vibrant woman who'd been frozen in time since 2007. They showed photos of her burned-out car, the remote gulch where her remains had been discovered, and now the mugshot of Lester Jones, looking older and heavier than in photos from 2007, his expression blank and unreadable. Frank Bergfeld appeared at a press conference, flanked by his wife Suzanne and other family members. His voice was steady but thick with emotion, as he thanked the investigators who'd never given up, who'd continued working the case even when it seemed hopeless. He spoke about Paige, about the daughter and mother who'd been stolen from them, about the 7 years of not knowing, of living in limbo between hope and despair. "We always knew this day would come," Frank said, though his eyes suggested he'd had moments of doubt. "One never stopped believing that whoever did this to Paige would be held accountable. Today is the first step toward justice." Paige's children, now teenagers, did not appear at the press conference. They were being shielded from the media circus that was beginning to swirl around the case, protected from the gruesome details that would inevitably emerge during the trial. They'd lived more than half their lives without their mother. The oldest, Jess, was now in his early 20s. The younger two were in high school. They'd grown up with an absence that had shaped them in ways both visible and hidden. Jones was held without bond, deemed a flight risk and a danger to the community. His public defender entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf, and the long process of preparing for trial began. The prosecution was led by Deputy District Attorney David Kaplan, a seasoned prosecutor known for his meticulous preparation and courtroom skills. Kaplan had handled numerous murder cases over his career, but this one was special. The entire community had been waiting for this moment. The pressure to get a conviction was enormous. Kaplan knew the case had weaknesses. The evidence against Jones was circumstantial. There was no DNA, no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, no confession. Everything they had was indirect phone records, GPS data, suspicious behavior, inconsistent statements. They'd need to weave all these separate threads into a narrative compelling enough to convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense team, led by attorney Trent Palmer, had a simpler strategy: create doubt. They didn't need to prove Jones was innocent. They just needed to show that the prosecution couldn't prove he was guilty. Palmer was experienced in defending difficult cases, and he knew that circumstantial evidence cases were vulnerable to reasonable doubt. The months between the arrest and trial were consumed with legal maneuvering. Both sides filed countless motions to exclude evidence, motions to include evidence, motions about what witnesses could testify about and what they couldn't. The judge, Richard Gurley, presided over these preliminary hearings with patience and precision, making rulings that would shape how the trial would unfold. One of the biggest fights was over whether the prosecution could introduce evidence about Paige's escort work. The defense argued it was prejudicial, that it would bias the jury against Paige and distract from the actual evidence. The prosecution countered that it was essential context. The escort work was how Jones had met Paige, and understanding their relationship was crucial to understanding motive. Judge Gurley ruled that the evidence could be introduced, but with limitations. Prosecutors could explain that Paige ran an escort service and that Jones was a client, but they couldn't dwell on salacious details or suggest that Paige's profession made her death somehow less tragic or important. Another contentious issue was the GPS evidence. The defense argued that the GPS data was unreliable, that the margin of error was too large to definitively place Jones at the body dump site. They brought in their own expert witnesses who testified about the limitations of GPS technology, especially older systems like the one in Jones's truck. The prosecution countered with their own experts who explained how GPS worked, how the data was stored and retrieved, and how the location pings, while not perfectly precise, were accurate enough to be meaningful when combined with other evidence. Judge Gurley allowed the GPS evidence, but instructed that the jury would hear testimony from both sides about its reliability and limitations. As the trial date approached, the media attention intensified. National crime shows like 48 Hours and Dateline NBC sent producers to Grand Junction interviewing family members, investigators, and anyone else willing to talk. The case had everything that made for compelling television: a beautiful victim, a secret double life, a years-long mystery, and finally, a suspect facing justice. Paige's story was told and retold, each version adding new details or emphasis. Some coverage focused on her as a devoted mother forced into sex work by financial desperation. Other coverage portrayed her as a savvy businesswoman who'd made choices about her own body and livelihood. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any single narrative could capture. The trial was scheduled to begin in October 2016, more than 9 years after Paige's disappearance. The courthouse in Grand Junction prepared for the onslaught of media and spectators. Additional security was brought in. A larger courtroom was designated to accommodate the expected crowds. Jury selection took nearly 2 weeks. The attorneys questioned hundreds of potential jurors, looking for people who could be fair and impartial despite the massive publicity the case had received. It was nearly impossible to find anyone in the Grand Junction area who hadn't heard about Paige Bergfeld's disappearance. But the goal was to find jurors who could set aside what they'd heard and base their verdict solely on evidence presented at trial. Eventually, a jury was seated, 12 people and several alternates, representing a cross-section of the community. They were given stern instructions about not discussing the case with anyone, not reading news coverage, not doing their own research. They were told this would be a long trial, potentially lasting several weeks. On October 17, 2016, opening statements began. The courtroom was packed. Paige's family sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, Frank and Suzanne holding hands, their faces set in expressions of determined grief. Across the aisle, Jones sat with his defense team, wearing a suit that hung loosely on his frame, his face impassive as he stared straight ahead. David Kaplan stood and addressed the jury. His opening statement was measured and methodical, laying out the story of Paige's life and death in clear, chronological detail. He started with June 28, 2007, a normal day that ended in horror. He described Paige as a loving mother and hardworking woman who'd done what she felt necessary to provide for her children. He explained her escort business without apology or judgment, framing it as simply another job, another way to make money in a world that wasn't always kind to single mothers. He told the jury about Lester Jones, a client who'd become obsessed with Paige, who'd called her constantly, who'd become angry when she tried to create boundaries. He walked them through the phone records, showing the pattern of escalating contact, the desperate calls on the day she disappeared, and then the sudden silence. He described the discovery of Paige's burned car, the evidence that pointed to foul play, the long years of investigation. He talked about the discovery of her remains in Wells Gulch, the remote location where someone had dumped her body, expecting it would never be found. And then he presented the key evidence, the GPS data showing Jones's truck near the dump site around the time of Paige's death, the cell phone records placing him in that area, the inconsistencies in his statements to police, the lack of any alibi for the crucial hours when Paige disappeared. The evidence will show, Kaplan told the jury, that Lester Jones killed Paige Bergfeld. He strangled her, he dumped her body in the desert, and he burned her car to destroy evidence. He thought he'd gotten away with it. He almost did. But the truth has a way of coming out, and you will see that truth in this courtroom. He sat down. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Trent Palmer stood for the defense. His approach was different, more conversational, more folksy. He acknowledged the tragedy of Paige's death, expressed sympathy for her family, and then got to the heart of his case. The prosecution wants you to believe that Lester Jones killed Paige Bergfeld, Palmer said. But wanting you to believe something and proving it are two very different things. They're going to show you phone records, and yes, Mr. Jones called Paige. He was her client. Of course he called her. They're going to show you GPS data, and yes, Jones drove all over western Colorado in his truck. That was his job. He was a truck driver. He drove everywhere. Palmer walked the jury through the gaps in the prosecution's case. No DNA evidence. No forensic evidence connecting Jones to the crime. No witnesses who saw him with Paige on June 28th. No murder weapon, no confession. The prosecution is asking you to convict Mr. Jones based on suspicion and speculation, Palmer said. They're asking you to connect dots that don't necessarily connect. They're asking you to assume that because Mr. Jones knew Paige, because he called her, because his truck was in the general area where her body was found months or years later, that he must have killed her. But that's not how our justice system works. The prosecution has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And when you look at the actual evidence, not the speculation, not the theories, but the actual evidence, you'll see that they haven't done that. He reminded the jury that Paige had been an escort who met many men, any of whom could have harmed her. He suggested that the police had focused on Jones early and had developed tunnel vision, ignoring other possibilities. He promised that the defense would present evidence showing that Jones couldn't have committed this crime. Palmer sat down, and the trial began in earnest. The prosecution called witness after witness, building their case piece by piece. They started with Paige's family and friends, humanizing her for the jury. Frank Bergfeld testified about his daughter, his voice breaking as he described the last time he'd seen her, how vibrant and alive she'd been, how devoted to her children. Paige's friends testified about her character, hardworking, loving, always putting her kids first. Her pampered chef colleagues talked about her sales skills, her warmth, her ability to make everyone feel special. Then the prosecution shifted to the darker side of Paige's life. They called witnesses who knew about her escort business, not clients, but people she'd confided in. A close friend testified that Paige had mentioned having trouble with a client who was getting too attached, who wouldn't respect boundaries. The friend couldn't remember if Paige had named the client, but the testimony established that someone in Paige's professional life had been causing her stress. Investigators testified about finding and processing Paige's burned car. Crime scene technicians walked the jury through the photographs, the scorched interior, the melted dashboard, Paige's purse with her ID and credit card still inside. The message was clear. This wasn't a woman who'd left voluntarily. The medical examiner who'd analyzed Paige's remains took the stand. He displayed photographs of the bones recovered from Wells Gulch, explaining in clinical detail how he'd identified them as Paige's through dental records. He showed the jury the fractured hyoid bone, explaining that this injury was consistent with strangulation. Though he acknowledged under cross-examination that he couldn't be absolutely certain of the cause of death due to the decomposition and skeletal nature of the remains. The rancher who'd discovered the remains testified about finding the bones, about his initial shock and then his certainty that they were human. He described the remoteness of the location, how unlikely it was that anyone would stumble across that particular spot. Then came the critical witnesses, the experts who would tie Jones to the crime through technology. A forensic analyst from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation testified about extracting data from Jones's old GPS unit. She explained the process in painstaking detail, showing the jury printouts of coordinates and routes. She highlighted the data points that placed Jones's truck near Wells Gulch in late June 2007. The defense cross-examined aggressively, pointing out the margin of error, suggesting that near Wells Gulch could mean miles away, questioning whether the dates and PS were even accurate. The analyst held her ground, acknowledging the limitations but insisting that the data was reliable within its known parameters. A cell phone analyst testified of records from June 2007. He created a timeline of calls and text messages between Jones and Paige, showing the jury how the contact had intensified in the weeks before her disappearance. He showed the calls on June 28, the last brief connection at 9:43 p.m., and then nothing. He also presented data about which cell towers Jones's phone had pinged in the hours after Paige's last call. The phone had been in the Grand Junction area, then had moved south toward the more remote areas where Wells Gulch was located, then back north toward Fruita where Jones lived. The prosecution rested its case after 3 weeks of testimony. They'd presented 40 witnesses, hundreds of exhibits, thousands of pages of phone records, GPS data, and forensic reports. They'd built a circumstantial case that, piece by piece, pointed toward Jones as Paige's killer. Now it was the defense's turn. Palmer's strategy was to attack the reliability of the technical evidence and to present alternative explanations for everything the prosecution had shown. He called his own GPS expert who testified that the technology in 2007 was far less accurate than modern systems, that the margin of error could be as much as a half mile or more, especially in areas with limited satellite coverage like the rural canyons around Wells Gulch. He called a cell phone expert, who Excel tower pings didn't provide precise locations. That a phone could ping off a tower from many different locations. That the data the prosecution relied on was ambiguous at best. The defense also called character witnesses for Jones. People he'd worked with, neighbors who'd known him for years. They testified that he'd always been quiet, respectful. That they'd never seen any signs of violence or aggression. One neighbor said Jones had helped her move furniture when her husband was out of town. That he'd been nothing but kind and helpful. Palmer tried to suggest that other suspects hadn't been adequately investigated. He questioned why certain escort clients hadn't been pursued more vigorously. Why the police had focused so intensely on Jones while potentially ignoring other leads. But the defense had a fundamental problem. They couldn't definitively place Jones anywhere else during the critical hours when Paige disappeared. They couldn't explain away the phone records showing the escalating contact and the suspicious timing. They couldn't account for why Jones's truck had been in the area where Paige's body was found. Jones himself faced a crucial decision whether to testify in his own defense. It was a gamble. If he took the stand, he could tell his story directly to the jury, could look them in the eye and proclaim his innocence. But he'd also be subject to cross-examination by Kaplan, who would pick apart every statement, every inconsistency, every suspicious detail. Palmer advised against it. The prosecution hadn't proven their case beyond reasonable doubt, he argued. Why give them the opportunity to strengthen their case by cross-examining Jones? But Jones wanted to testify. He wanted to tell his side, to explain himself, to deny the charges directly. Against his lawyer's advice, Lester Jones took the stand. He was nervous, fidgeting in the witness box, his voice sometimes barely audible. Palmer led him through friendly questioning, establishing his background, his work as a truck driver, his relationship with Paige. Jones admitted hiring Paige for escort services. He said he'd liked her, enjoyed her company, but denied being obsessed or possessive. The frequent phone calls. He was just trying to arrange appointments, he said. He was a regular client, of course he called often. He denied having anything to do with her disappearance. The last time it was several days before she vanished, he testified. Their final phone call on June 28th had been brief. He'd asked if she was available. She'd said no, that was it. As for his truck being near Wells Gulch, he explained that he drove all over western Colorado for work. He might have been in that general area, but he certainly hadn't dumped a body there. The GPS data was inaccurate, he insisted. The cell tower data was inconclusive. Palmer sat down and Kaplan stood up for cross-examination. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Kaplan started gently, almost friendly, lulling Jones into a false sense of security. He asked about Jones's work schedule, his roots, his relationship with Paige. Jones answered carefully, sticking to his story. Then Kaplan shifted. He pulled out phone records, showing Jones specific calls. You called Paige 12 times in 3 hours on June 22nd. Is that normal for someone who just wants to arrange an appointment? I wanted to see her. She wasn't answering. You were persistent. I was a client. I wanted an appointment, even when she wasn't responding. Even when she was clearly avoiding you. I don't know if she was avoiding me. She was busy. Kaplan moved to the day Paige disappeared. You called her 3 times on June 28th. The last call was at 9:43 p.m. That call lasted 47 seconds. What did you talk about? Jones hesitated. I don't remember exactly. I think I asked if she was available and she said no. That's a pretty short conversation for 47 seconds. I don't know. Maybe we talked about other things. It's been years. But you remember clearly that you asked if she was available and she said no. Yes, I think so. You think so, or you remember? Kaplan paused, letting the contradiction hang in the air. Then he pulled out a map showing Wells Gulch and the surrounding area. Your truck was in this area on June 29th, early morning. What were you doing there? I don't know that I was there. That GPS data isn't reliable. But your cell phone was also pinging off towers in that area. Are the cell records reliable too? I might have been driving through. I drove all over for work. What delivery were you making that would take you to a remote gulch miles off any main road? Jones had no answer. He fumbled, talked about sometimes exploring back roads, about maybe taking a wrong turn. It sounded weak, and Kaplan knew it. You told police in 2007 that you hadn't been in that area. Now you're saying you might have been. Which is it? I don't remember what I told them exactly, but you remember clearly that you didn't kill Paige Bergfeld. Yes, I remember that. Kaplan pressed harder, finding contradictions in Jones's testimony, exposing the weaknesses in his explanations. By the time cross-examination ended, Jones looked exhausted and defeated. His testimony had done more harm than good. The defense rested. Both sides prepared for closing arguments. The closing arguments began on a cold November morning. The trial had stretched over nearly a month, and the jury looked wary. They'd heard from dozens of witnesses, examined hundreds of exhibits, and absorbed thousands of pages of technical testimony. Now it was time for the lawyers to tie it all together, to give the jurors a framework for understanding everything they'd seen and heard. David Kaplan went first. He stood before the jury with a large timeline he'd prepared, stretching across a whiteboard on an easel. It showed June 28, 2007, hour by hour, with color-coded entries showing Paige's activities, Jones's phone calls, the cell tower pings, and the GPS coordinates. Let me tell you what happened to Paige Bergfeld. Kaplan began, his voice steady and confident. On June 28, 2007, Paige was going about her day. She had pampered chef appointments. She was texting with friends. She was being a mom, a businesswoman, a person living her life. And Lester Jones was calling her, over and over. He called her 3 times that day. The first 2 calls went to voicemail. She didn't want to talk to him. Kaplan walked the jury through the timeline, pointing to each entry as he spoke. At 9:43 p.m. Jones called again. This time, Paige answered. The call lasted 47 seconds. We don't know exactly what was said, but we know what happened next. Paige's phone went dark. It never showed activity again. She never called her children, never called her friends, never used her credit cards, never went home. Paige Bergfeld ceased to exist. He paused, letting that sink in. Where was Lester Jones during this time? His phone records show him in Grand Junction, in the area where Paige lived and worked. And then in the early morning hours of June 29th, his phone starts pinging off towers south of town near Wells Gulch. His GPS, his own truck's GPS, places him in that area. The same area where Paige's body would be found years later. Kaplan moved to a map of the region, pointing to the locations. This isn't a coincidence. This isn't a random Trevor happening to drive through a remote area for no reason. This is the defendant taking Paige's body to a place where he thought it would never be found. And he almost got away with it. He addressed the defense's arguments head on. The defense wants you to focus on what we don't have. We don't have DNA. We don't have a confession. We don't have an eyewitness. But you know what we do have? We have evidence that places the defendant with the victim right before she disappeared. We have evidence that places the defendant's truck at the body dump site right after she disappeared. We have evidence of the defendant's obsessive behavior, his constant calls, his refusal to accept rejection. Kaplan's voice rose slightly, passion creeping into his measured delivery. Paige Bergfeld was strangled to death. Someone wrapped their hands around her neck and squeezed until she stopped breathing. Someone dumped her body in the desert like garbage. Someone burned her car to destroy evidence. And all the evidence, all of it, points to one person. Lester Ralph Jones. He walked back to the timeline, tapping it with his finger. The defense will tell you this is all circumstantial. They'll tell you it's just a theory. But circumstantial evidence is real evidence. You can convict based on circumstantial evidence, and people are convicted every day based on it. When you put all these pieces together, the phone records, the GPS data, the cell tower pings, the defendant's lies and inconsistencies, there's only one conclusion that makes sense. Lester Jones killed Paige Bergfeld. Kaplan returned to his seat. The courtroom was absolutely silent after a brief recess. Trent Palmer stood for the defense closing argument. His approach was different, less dramatic, more analytical. He wanted the jury to think like detectives, to question everything. The prosecution just gave you a very compelling story. Palmer began. It's a story that makes sense. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It has a villain and a victim. But here's the thing about stories, they're not always true. And the prosecution's job isn't to tell you a compelling story. Their job is to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Lester Jones killed Paige Bergfeld. And they haven't done that. Palmer walked the jury through the weaknesses in the prosecution's case. Let's talk about this GPS evidence they're so proud of. Their own expert admitted the margin of error is significant. The coordinates place Mr. Jones's truck in a general area, an area that encompasses miles of terrain. Could he have been at the exact spot where Paige's body was found? Maybe. Could he have been miles away, driving on a completely different road? Absolutely. He moved to the cell tower data. Cell towers don't provide precise locations. They tell you that a phone was somewhere within the range of that tower, a range that can be miles wide. The prosecution wants you to believe this data proves Mr. Jones was at Wells Gulch dumping a body. But it doesn't prove that. It proves his phone was in the general area. That's it. Palmer addressed the phone records. Yes, Mr. Jones called Paige frequently. He was a client. That's what clients do. They call to arrange appointments. The prosecution makes it sound sinister, but it's completely normal behavior for someone who is paying for escort services. Paige had dozens of clients. Many of them called her frequently. Does that make all of them murderers? He pointed out the lack of physical evidence. There's no DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no witnesses. Nothing that definitively connects Mr. Jones to this crime. The prosecution built their case on assumptions and inferences, but they haven't proven anything. Palmer's voice grew more urgent. Here's what really bothers me about this case: tunnel vision. From the moment Paige disappeared, the police focused on Lester Jones. They decided he was their guy, and they stopped looking at anyone else. But Paige was an escort. She met strangers regularly, often in private settings. Any one of those men could have harmed her. But did the police thoroughly investigate all of them? Did they pursue other leads with the same intensity they pursued Mr. Jones? I don't think they did. He walked over to where Jones sat and placed a hand on his client's shoulder. Mr. Jones is a truck driver. He's not a criminal mastermind. The prosecution wants you to believe he committed this perfect crime, killed Paige, disposed of her body in a place where it wouldn't be found for 5 years, burned her car to destroy evidence, all without leaving a trace of physical evidence. Does that seem likely? Or does it seem more likely that the police got the wrong guy? Palmer returned to center stage. The prosecution needs to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a high standard, and it should be. We don't convict people in this country based on suspicions and maybes. We convict based on proof. And when you look at the actual proof, not the theories, not the assumptions, but the actual proof, you'll see there's reasonable doubt all over this case. He looked each juror in the eye. I'm asking you to do the hard thing. I'm asking you to set aside the emotional aspects of this case, the sympathy you naturally feel for Paige and her family, and look at the evidence objectively. When you do that, when you really examine what the prosecution has proven versus what they've merely suggested, I believe you'll conclude that they haven't met their burden. I believe you'll find Lester Jones not guilty. Palmer sat down. Now it was Kaplan's turn for rebuttal. Kaplan stood and addressed Palmer's arguments directly. The defense wants you to focus on what they call reasonable doubt. But let's be clear about what reasonable doubt means. It doesn't mean any doubt. It doesn't mean a fanciful doubt or a doubt based on speculation. It means a doubt based on reason, based on the evidence. He walked back to his timeline. The defense says the GPS evidence isn't precise enough. Fine, let's set it aside for a moment. The defense says the cell tower data is too general. Okay, let's set that aside too. Now let's look at what's left. We have phone records showing obsessive behavior. We have the defendant lying to police's whereabouts. We have no alibi for the crucial hours. We have the defendant's own testimony, where he contradicted himself repeatedly. Kaplan's voice grew stronger. The defense asks why there's no physical evidence. Let me tell you why. Because Paige's body was in the desert for 5 years. Because animals scattered her remains. Because weather and time destroyed most of the evidence. Because the defendant burned her car. That's why there's no physical evidence. The absence of physical evidence isn't proof of innocence. It's proof of how much time passed and how carefully this crime was concealed. He addressed the tunnel vision argument. The defense says police didn't investigate other suspects. That's simply not true. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. They looked at every client they could identify. They followed every lead. And you know what? Every one of those other leads went nowhere. Every alibi checked out. Every other suspect was eliminated. Only one person couldn't account for his whereabouts. Only one person lied to investigators. Only one person had the means, motive, and opportunity. Lester Jones. Capelin walked over to where Paige's family sat. He didn't point at them, didn't exploit their grief, but his gesture acknowledged their presence. Paige Bergfeld was a mother of 3. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She made choices in her life that some might judge, but those choices don't make her death any less tragic or any less criminal. She was murdered. Her killer thought he'd get away with it. But he didn't. He turned back to the jury. When you go into that deliberation room, you're going to be asked to consider all the evidence, not pieces of it. Not selected parts that support one theory or another, all of it. And when you look at all the evidence together, there's only one reasonable conclusion. Lester Jones killed Paige Bergfeld. Find him guilty. Give Paige's family the justice they've been waiting for. Thank you. The closing arguments were finished. Judge Gurley gave the jury their instructions, lengthy, detailed explanations of the law they needed to apply, the definitions of the charges, the meaning of reasonable doubt. The instructions took more than an hour to read. The jurors listened intently, some taking notes. Finally, at 20:30 p.m. on November 17, 2016, the jury was sent to deliberate. The waiting began. Paige's family remained at the courthouse, unable to leave, unable to do anything but wait. They sat in a victim's advocate office, drinking stale coffee, checking their phones obsessively, even though knew the verdict would be announced in court. Not via text message, Frank Bergfeld paced. He'd been waiting for this moment for 9 years, 9 years of wondering, investigating, hoping, despairing. Now it was in the hands of 12 strangers who would decide whether his daughter's killer would be held accountable. Jones was taken back to jail to wait. Palmer and his team returned to their office, preparing for either outcome. Capelin and his prosecutors remained near the courthouse, reviewing their case, second-guessing their strategy, wondering if they'd done enough. The first day of deliberations ended with no verdict. The jury was sent home with instructions not to discuss the case with anyone. They'd return the next morning to continue. The second day passed. Still no verdict. The courtroom staff began to worry. Long deliberations could mean the jury was deadlocked, unable to reach consensus. If they couldn't agree, it would be a mystery, and the entire process would have to begin again. On the third day, a note came from the jury room. They had questions about the GPS evidence, specifically about the margin of error and how to interpret the coordinates. Judge Gurley brought them into the courtroom and had the relevant testimony read back to them. They returned to deliberate. Hours passed. Then, late in the afternoon of the third day, another note. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Word spread through Grand Junction that a verdict was coming, and spectators rushed to the courthouse. Paige's family took their seats, holding hands, preparing for whatever came next. Jones was brought from the jail and seated at the defense table, his face pale. Judge Gurley asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreman, a middle-aged man who'd been silent throughout the trial, stood and said they had. On the charge of first-degree murder. The foreman's voice was steady. We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Paige's family broke down in tears, relief, vindication all mixed together. Spectators gasped and whispered. Jones sat motionless, staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. Judge Gurley gabbled for order. On the charge of second-degree murder. Guilty. On the charge of second-degree kidnapping. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. Frank Bergfeld sobbed openly. His wife Cutter's killer had been convicted. Justice delayed, hard won. Incomplete but real had been served. Jones was led away in handcuffs. He didn't look at his family in the gallery. Didn't look at Paige's family. Just walked out flanked by deputies. Back to the jail that would be his home until sentencing. Outside the courthouse, Kaplan held a press conference. This verdict brings some measure of closure to Paige Bergfeld's family, he said. It doesn't bring Paige back. It doesn't undo the suffering her children have endured. But it does hold the person responsible for her death accountable for his actions. Frank Bergfeld also spoke to the media, his voice hoarse with emotion. We've waited 9 years for this day. 9 years of not knowing, of living in this horrible limbo. Today we finally have answers. Today, Paige's killer was found guilty. We can never get Paige back, but we can know that the person who took her from us for what he did. The conviction brought celebration, but it also brought complications. Palmer immediately announced plans to appeal. The defense argued that there had been errors during the trial, issues with the GPS evidence, problems with jury instructions, questions about whether Jones should have been allowed to testify. Sentencing was scheduled for January 2017, 2 months after the verdict. Colorado law mandated a life sentence for first-degree murder, but there would be a hearing where Paige's family could make victim impact statements, where they could tell the court and Jones what his actions had cost them. But before that hearing could take place, Palmer filed a motion for a new trial. He argued that the GPS evidence had been improperly admitted, that the margin of error made it too unreliable to be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. He presented affidavits from additional experts, who questioned the accuracy of the data. Judge Gurley scheduled a hearing to consider the motion. It was a long shot. Motions for new trials rarely succeeded, but Palmer was doing his job, exploring every avenue to defend his client. In February 2017, Judge Gurley denied the motion. He ruled that the GPS evidence had been properly admitted, that the jury had been adequately instructed about its limitations, and that there were no grounds for a new trial. Sentencing was rescheduled for March 2017. The sentencing hearing was emotional and devastating. One by one, members of Paige's family took the stand to describe the impact of her death. Jess, Paige's oldest son, now in his mid-20s, spoke first. His voice shook as he read from a prepared statement. My mom was my best friend. She was always there for me, always supporting me, always believing in me. When she disappeared, I lost not just my mother, but my sense of security. My sense that the world was a safe place. I've spent the last 10 years wondering what happened to her, imagining terrible scenarios unable to grieve, because we didn't know if she was alive or dead. Now we know. Now we can grieve. But we can never get back the years we lost, the milestones she missed, the life we could have had if Lester Jones hadn't taken her from us. Paige's younger children, now teenagers, also spoke. They talked about growing up without a mother, about the questions that haunted them, about the hole in their lives that nothing could fill. They described school events where other kids had both parents, and they had none, their mother dead, their father trying his best but unable to be everything they needed. Frank Bergfeld spoke last. His prepared statement crumpled in his shaking hands. Lester Jones didn't just kill my daughter. He killed a piece of our whole family. He took a vibrant, loving, beautiful person and snuffed out her life. He left 3 children without their mother. He left us without our daughter. And for what? Because Paige wouldn't see him anymore. Because she tried to set boundaries. Because she dared to say no. Frank turned to look directly at Jones, who sat impassive at the defense table. I hope you understand what you've done. I hope you understand the magnitude of the pain you've caused. You took everything from Paige. You took everything from her children. You took everything from us. And now you'll spend the rest of your life in prison. And even that doesn't seem like enough. Jones was given an opportunity to speak. Palmer advised him to remain silent, but once again, Jones ignored his lawyer's advice. He stood and addressed the court. I didn't kill Paige Bergfeld. Jones said, his voice flat and emotionless. I've said it from the beginning, and I'll say it until the day I die. I didn't do this. The jury got it wrong. The police got it wrong. I'm innocent. He sat down. No apology. No expression of remorse. Just a continued denial that convinced no one. Judge Gurley delivered the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder conviction, with additional sentences for the other charges to run concurrently. Jones would die in prison. As deputies led Jones away for the last time, he glanced back at the gallery. His family was there. A nephew looking devastated. They believed in his innocence, or at least wanted to. But their belief didn't matter now. The justice system had spoken. Paige's family filed out of the courtroom exhausted but relieved it was over. After more than 9 years, the case was finally closed. Except it wasn't. In late 2017, Palmer filed an appeal with the Colorado Court of Appeals. The appeal raised several issues: the admissibility of the GPS evidence, the jury instructions, the admission of testimony about Paige's escort work, and the sufficiency of the evidence to support a first-degree murder conviction. The appeals process would take years. In the meantime, Jones sat in a maximum security prison, maintaining his innocence, writing letters to anyone who would listen, insisting he'd been wrongly convicted. The appeals court heard oral arguments in 2018. Palmer argued that the GPS evidence was fundamentally unreliable and should never have been admitted. He pointed to the margin of error, the age of the technology, and the fact that the prosecution's entire case rested on this shaky foundation. The prosecution countered that the GPS evidence was just one piece of a larger puzzle. Even without it, they argued, there was sufficient evidence to convict: the phone records, the cell tower data, Jones's lies and inconsistencies, his obsessive behavior. In December 2018, more than 11 years after Paige's death, the Colorado Court of Appeals issued a shocking ruling. They overturned Jones's conviction. The court found that the GPS evidence had been improperly admitted. The margin of error was too significant, the technology too unreliable to be the foundation of a murder conviction. The appeals court ruled that without the GPS evidence, there wasn't sufficient proof that Jones had been at the Wells Gulch location where Paige's body was found. The ruling didn't declare Jones innocent. It simply said the trial had been unfair, that critical evidence had been improperly admitted, and that he deserved a new trial. The decision devastated Paige's family. After years of fighting for justice, after finally getting a conviction, it had been taken away. They'd have to go through another trial, relive all the pain and horror, listen to all the testimony again. Frank Bergfeld appeared on the steps of the courthouse, his face aged beyond his years, his voice thick with exhaustion. "We will never stop fighting for Paige. If we have to do this all over again, we will. We will see justice served, no matter how long it takes." The district attorney's office immediately announced they would retrieve Jones. Kaplan, who'd moved on to other cases, was brought back to lead the prosecution again. Palmer remained as defense counsel. The second trial was scheduled for 2020. Lester Jones walked out of prison in January 2010, a free man for the first time in more than 2 years. The appeals court ruling had vacated his conviction, and while he still faced charges, the district attorney fully intended to retray him. He was released on bond pending the new trial. His release infuriated Paige's family and shocked the Grand Junction community. Here was a man who'd been convicted of murder, who a jury had found guilty beyond reasonable doubt, walking the streets again. Legal technicalities, they felt, had triumphed over justice. Jones returned to Fruita, moving into a small apartment, trying to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. He was prohibited from leaving the area, required to wear an ankle monitor, and had to check in regularly with authorities. But he was out. He could sleep in his own bed, eat what he wanted, walk outside without guards watching his every move. Palmer immediately began preparing for the second trial. He knew the prosecution would adjust their strategy, would try to minimize their reliance on the GPS evidence that had gotten the first conviction overturned. Palmer needed to be ready for whatever approach they took. Kaplan, meanwhile, was frustrated but undeterred. The appeals court had ruled the GPS evidence inadmissible, so he'd have to build his case without it. But he still had the phone records, the cell tower data, the testimony about Jones's obsessive behavior, and Jones's own inconsistent statements. The case would be harder without the GPS coordinates that had placed Jones's truck near the dump site. But it wasn't impossible. Both legal teams spent months preparing. They re-interviewed witnesses, consulted with new experts, developed new strategies. The second trial would be different from the first. Both sides had learned from the previous experience and would adjust accordingly. But before the trial could begin, the world changed. An early-teen pandemic swept across the globe. Courts shut down. Trials were postponed indefinitely. The justice system ground to a halt as the legal community figured out how to operate during a global health crisis. The second trial, originally scheduled for spring 2020, was delayed, then delayed again and again. Months turned into a year. Jones remained free on bond, living in Fruita, the charges hanging over him, but the trial perpetually pushed back. Paige's family grew increasingly frustrated. It had been 13 years since her death. 13 years of fighting for justice, of waiting for closure, of watching the legal system move at an agonizingly slow pace. Frank Bergfeld, now in his 70s, worried he might not live to see the case resolved. Finally, in late 2021, as courts began resuming normal operations, the second trial was scheduled for early 2022. Nearly 15 years after Paige's disappearance, Lester Jones would face a jury again. The jury selection process for the second trial was even more challenging than the first. The case had received extensive media coverage over the years, and the previous trial and conviction meant that virtually everyone in the Grand Junction area knew about it. Finding jurors who could be impartial, who could set aside what they'd heard and base their decision solely on evidence presented at trial, seemed almost impossible. The attorneys questioned potential jurors extensively. Many were dismissed because they'd followed the first trial closely, or had already formed opinions about Jones's guilt. Others were dismissed because they couldn't commit to a trial that might last several weeks. Eventually, after nearly 3 weeks of jury selection, a panel was seated. The second trial began in February 2022. Much of it resembled the first trial. The same witnesses testified, Paige's family members describing her life and character, investigators detailing the discovery of her burned car and skeletal remains, forensic experts explaining the evidence. But there were crucial differences in how the prosecution presented their case. Without the GPS evidence, Kaplan needed to make the cell tower data even more compelling. He brought in new expert witnesses who could explain cellular technology more clearly, who could show the jury how the pattern of tower pings created a map of Jones's movements on the night Paige disappeared. The expert testified that while cell towers couldn't provide exact locations, the pattern of which towers Jones's phone connected to told a story. The phone had pinged towers in Grand Junction in the evening, then towers progressively farther south overnight, then towers back north toward Fruita by morning. This pattern was consistent with someone driving from Grand Junction to the Wells Gulch area and back. The defense challenged this interpretation aggressively. Palmer brought in his own cellular expert who testified that fun off towers farther away when closer towers are busy, that the pattern could be explained by Jones simply driving his normal routes, that the data was too imprecise to prove anything. The battle of experts was technical and dry, but critically important. The jury would have to decide which expert to believe, whose interpretation of the data was more credible. Kaplan also placed greater emphasis on Jones's behavior and statements. He walked the jury through the phone records in even more detail than in the first trial, highlighting not just the frequency of Jones's calls but the pattern of escalation. He showed how Jones had become increasingly persistent, increasingly desperate, as Paige tried to create distance. He presented testimony from other escorts who'd worked with Jones, women who described him as demanding and difficult, someone who didn't handle rejection well. One woman testified that Jones had become angry when she'd tried to end their arrangement, showing up at her apartment unannounced, and only leaving when she threatened to call police. This testimony painted a picture of a man with a pattern of problematic behavior toward sex workers. Someone who felt entitled to their time and attention, someone who reacted badly when denied what he wanted. Palmer objected strenuously to this testimony, arguing it was prejudicial character evidence that had nothing to do with whether Jones killed Paige. But Judge Gurley allowed it, ruling that it showed a pattern of behavior relevant to understanding Jones's relationship with Paige and his potential motive. The prosecution also highlighted Jones's inconsistent statements to police over the years. Kaplan created a detailed timeline showing how Jones's story had changed, first claiming he hadn't seen Paige in weeks, then admitting to seeing her days before she vanished, then changing details about their last phone conversation. Innocent people don't lie to police, Kaplan told the jury. Innocent people don't change their stories multiple times. Innocent people tell the truth and stick to it. The defendant's ever-changing explanations aren't the words of an innocent man. They're the words of someone trying to cover his tracks. When it came time for the defense case, Palmer faced a critical decision. Should Jones testify again? In the first trial, Jones's testimony had been damaging. His cross-examination had exposed contradictions and weaknesses in his story. But now, years later, Jones had had time to refine his narrative, to prepare for the tough questions, to present a more coherent defense. Palmer consulted with Jones extensively. The decision was ultimately Jones's to make, but Palmer laid out the risks clearly. If Jones testified, Caplan would attack him mercilessly. Every inconsistency, every suspicious detail would be highlighted and exploited. But if Jones didn't testify, the jury might interpret his silence as an admission of guilt. In the first trial, Jones had proclaimed his innocence from the witness stand. If he remained silent now, would jurors wonder what he was hiding? Jones decided to testify again. This time he was more prepared. He'd spent years thinking about the case, about his answers, about how to explain away the suspicious evidence. His testimony was smoother, more polished than in the first trial. He explained the frequent phone calls to Paige as normal behavior for a regular client. I enjoyed her company. I wanted to see her. When you find someone you like spending time with, you want to arrange appointments. There's nothing sinister about that. He addressed the cell tower data. I was a truck driver. I drove all over western Colorado. Sometimes I'd take back roads, explore areas I hadn't been before. I can't tell you exactly where I was every minute of every day from 15 years ago. But I can tell you I didn't kill Paige Bergfeld. He explained his inconsistent statements to police as confusion and fear. I was scared. The police were treating me like a suspect from day one. I didn't have anything to do with Paige's disappearance, but they made me feel like they'd already decided I was guilty. So yeah, maybe I wasn't completely straight with them at first. Maybe I tried to minimize how often I saw her because I was embarrassed, because I didn't want my escort activities exposed. But that doesn't make me a murderer. Palmer walked Jones through his version of events carefully, trying to present him as a sympathetic figure. A lonely man who'd hired escorts for companionship, who'd liked Paige but had nothing to do with her death, who'd been railroaded by police with tunnel vision. Then Caplan stood for cross-examination. He started with the phone records, just as he had in the first trial. But this time, he had a new approach. He'd spent the years since the first trial analyzing Jones's phone activity, not just on June 28, 2007, but in after. Mr. Jones, you called Paige 12 times on June 22nd. How many times did you call her the day after she disappeared? Jones hesitated. I don't remember, Caplan said. You didn't call her at all on June 29th, or June 30th, or July 1st. You went from calling her constantly to not calling her at all. Why? I assumed she was busy. Maybe I figured she needed space. You figured she needed space. The woman you'd been calling 12 times in one day, you suddenly decided she needed space. Isn't it more likely that you stopped calling because you knew she was dead? Because you'd killed her? No, that's not. You didn't call her. You didn't text her. You made no attempt to contact her after June 28th. Because you knew she couldn't answer. Because you knew exactly what had happened to her. Palmer objected, arguing that Caplan was testifying rather than questioning. Judge Gurley sustained the objection, but the point had been made. The jury had seen Jones squirm, had heard the compelling logic of Caplan's argument. Caplan moved to the cell tower data, walking Jones through where his phone had been hour by hour. He showed how the pattern matched a trip from Grand Junction south to the remote area where Paige's body was found. You told police you didn't go to that area. Were you lying? I may have been mistaken. It's been 15 years. So you were either lying then or you're lying now. Which is it? Jones had no good answer. Caplan pressed on, finding contradictions, exposing weaknesses, chipping away at Jones's credibility. By the time cross-examination ended, Jones looked defeated once again. His testimony had hurt more than helped, just as it had in the first trial. The defense rested. Closing arguments approached. Caplan's closing in the second trial was similar to his first, but with adjustments to account for the missing GPS evidence. He focused heavily on the pattern of behavior, the phone records, the cell tower data, and Jones's lies. The GPS evidence is gone, Kaplan acknowledged. The appeals court said we can't use it, so we won't. But you know what? We don't need it. Because everything else still points to Lester Jones. His obsessive behavior, his constant calls, his presence in the area where Paige's body was found, his lies to police, his complete lack of alibi, his sudden cessation of all contact with Paige after June 28th. He walked the jury through the timeline again, showing how every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Some pieces of evidence are like puzzle pieces that clearly fit together. Others are more ambiguous, subject to interpretation. But when you step back and look at the whole picture, when you see all the pieces together, there's only one image that makes sense. Lester Jones killed Paige Bergfeld. Palmer's closing emphasized reasonable doubt even more than in the first trial. The prosecution admitted they don't have the GPS evidence this time. They admitted it was unreliable. But that was the centerpiece of their case in the first trial. Without it, what do they have? Phone records showing a client called an escort. Cell tower data that shows someone was in a general area. Testimony about someone being pushy with other escorts. That's it. That's what they're asking you to convict on. Palmer walked the jury through alternative explanations for every piece of evidence. The phone calls, normal client behavior, the cell tower data, consistent with Jones's job driving all over the region, the inconsistent statements, confusion and fear of a man being falsely accused. The prosecution needs to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, Palmer said. Not beyond all doubt, reasonable doubt. And when you really examine this evidence, when you really think about what they've proven versus what they've merely suggested, I believe you'll find doubt everywhere. The jury began deliberating on March 4, 2022. Once again, the waiting began. Once again, Paige's family sat in the courthouse, unable to leave, unable to do anything but wait and hope. The first day passed with no verdict. The second day, the third. On the fourth day of deliberations, a note came from the jury room. They were deadlocked. They couldn't reach a unanimous decision. Judge Gurley brought them into the courtroom and gave them an Allen charge, instructions encouraging them to continue deliberating, to listen to each other's viewpoints, to try to reach consensus. He sent them back to keep trying. Another day passed. Then another. After 6 days of deliberations, the jury sent another note. They were still deadlocked. Despite extended discussions, despite reviewing evidence, despite genuine efforts to reach agreement, they couldn't unanimously agree on a verdict. Judge Gurley faced a difficult decision. He could declare a mistrial, which would mean starting over with a third trial. Or he could send them back to keep deliberating, hoping they'd eventually reach consensus. He called the jury into the courtroom. How many of you believe that additional deliberation time might help you reach a verdict? 2 hands went up out of 12. The rest shook their heads. Judge Gurley had his answer. I'm declaring a mistrial. The jury is unable to reach a unanimous verdict. You're dismissed with the court's thanks for your service. The courtroom erupted in disappointment and frustration. Paige's family was devastated. Another trial with no resolution. Another postponement of justice. Jones, on the other hand, looked relieved. A deadlocked jury meant he wasn't convicted. It meant the prosecution's case was weaker than they'd thought. It meant he might yet be acquitted. The district attorney's office faced a crucial decision: try Jones a third time, or give up. A third trial would be expensive, time-consuming, and carried significant risk. 2 juries had now failed to convict. 1 conviction overturned on appeal. 1 hung jury unable to reach a verdict. What were the chances that a third jury would do better? But giving up meant Jones would go free. It meant Paige's killer, and prosecutors remained convinced Jones was guilty, would never be held accountable. After extensive deliberation, the district attorney announced they would proceed with a third trial. We owe it to Paige and her family to see this through. We believe Lester Jones murdered Paige Bergfeld, and we will continue seeking justice until we either get a conviction or exhaust every option available to us. The third trial was scheduled for early 2023, 16 years after Paige's death. But in the months between the mistrial and the scheduled third trial, something unexpected happened. Investigators received a tip from an inmate in the Colorado prison system. The inmate claimed that Jones had confided in him during Jones's brief incarceration between the first conviction and the appeals court ruling. According to the inmate, Jones had described how he killed Paige, where he'd dumped her body, and how he'd burned her car. The inmate's story was detailed and specific. He said Jones had told him that Paige had tried to end their arrangement, that they'd argued, that things had gotten physical. Jones had strangled her, the inmate claimed, then panicked about what to do with the body. He'd driven her out to Wells Gulch, a place he knew from his trucking routes, and left her there. Then he'd driven her car to the Lowe's parking lot and set it on fire. If true, this was the smoking gun prosecutors needed, a confession, even if secondhand, but jailhouse informant testimony is notoriously unreliable. Inmates have incentives to fabricate stories. They might be seeking reduced sentences, better treatment, or other benefits from cooperating with authorities. Defense attorneys routinely attack such testimony as self-serving lies. Prosecutors had to decide whether to use this witness. The testimony could be powerful, but it could also backfire if the jury didn't believe the inmate. They investigated the informant thoroughly. They looked for any evidence that corroborated his story, any details he couldn't have known unless Jones had actually told him. They examined what the inmate might gain from testifying. Was he seeking a deal? The investigation revealed that the inmate had no pending cases, wasn't seeking any reduction in his own sentence, and had no obvious motive to lie. Moreover, some of the details he provided, like the specific location where Paige's body was found, weren't public knowledge when Jones had supposedly confided in him. Prosecutors decided the testimony was credible enough to use. The third trial began in March 2023. Much of it was familiar, the same basic evidence, the same witnesses, the same legal arguments. But the jailhouse informant's testimony was new and potentially devastating. The inmate, a convicted felon named Marcus Webb, took the stand and described meeting Jones in prison. They'd been cellmates briefly, he said, and had spent long hours talking. He said he didn't mean to kill her. Webb testified. He said things just got out of hand. She wouldn't see him anymore, wouldn't talk to him, and he got angry. He said he just wanted to scare her, to make her understand how serious he was. But when he grabbed her, she fought back, and he squeezed her neck until she stopped fighting. Webb's testimony was calm and detailed. He described how Jones had claimed to feel guilty, to have nightmares about what he'd done, but also to believe he'd gotten away with it. Palmer attacked Webb viciously during cross-examination. He pointed out Webb's criminal record, drug charges, assault. He suggested Webb was testifying to curry favor with authorities, to improve his situation in prison. "You're a convicted criminal, are you not?" Palmer asked. "Yes," Webb admitted. "You're willing to lie to get what you want." "I've lied in the past." "Yes, but I'm not lying now." "How convenient. You expect this jury to believe you, a man with a history of dishonesty, are suddenly telling the truth now." "I know what I heard. Jones told me he killed her." Palmer tried to poke holes in Webb's story, to find inconsistencies between what Webb claimed Jones said and what the evidence showed. But Webb's account was remarkably consistent with the known facts of the case. The third trial moved swiftly after Webb's testimony. Both sides had refined their arguments through 2 previous trials, and the jury seemed eager to reach a decision that had eluded the previous panel. Kaplan's closing argument was his most passionate yet. 3 trials, 16 years. How much longer does Paige's family have to wait for justice? The evidence has always pointed to one person. Lester Jones killed Paige Bergfeld. He strangled her. He dumped her body in the desert. He burned her car. And now you've heard Jones confided in someone he told about what he did. You have the phone records, the cell tower data, the lies, the behavior, and now a confession. How much more do you need? Palmer fought back in his closing, attacking Webb's credibility relentlessly. A jailhouse snitch with everything to gain and nothing to lose tells you what prosecutors want to hear, and you're supposed to believe him. This is reasonable doubt personified. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On March 23, 2023, they returned with a verdict. Guilty of first-degree kidnapping. Paige's family collapsed in tears. 16 years of fighting, 3 trials, countless setbacks, finally justice. Jones showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs. At sentencing in May 2023, Judge Gurley imposed life in prison without parole. Frank Bergfeld, now 76 years old, addressed the court one final time. Paige was 34 when she died. She'd be 50 now. She missed watching her children grow up, graduate, start their own lives. Lester Jones took all of that from her, from us. But he couldn't take our love for her. He couldn't take our memories. And he couldn't escape justice forever. Jones was taken to a maximum security facility where he'll spend the rest of his life. He continues to maintain his innocence. But his appeals have been exhausted. Paige's children have built lives despite the tragedy. They've graduated college, started careers, found love. They carry their mother's memory with them. The woman who worked multiple jobs to provide for them, who loved them fiercely, whose life was stolen but whose legacy endures. Grand Junction has moved on, but hasn't forgotten. A scholarship fund in Paige's name helps single mothers pursue education. Her case led to reforms in how law enforcement handles missing persons cases involving sex workers. On quiet evenings in western Colorado, when the sun sets over the red rock formations and shadows stretch across the valley, some people still think about Paige Bardfeld, the mother, the daughter, the woman whose disappearance shocked a community and whose murder took 16 years to solve. Justice came slowly, but it came. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.